This will be a formal debate, and that means, brothers, that there will not be audience participation. The four guys that you see in the front of the room are your debaters. The debate takes about an hour, and then after the hour is up and the debate is concluded, we will have a time for some discussion. So as we go along, if you have questions or thoughts, just jot them down or make a mental note, and we will have time to address those as we go along. I'm assisted tonight with Worshipful Brother Keith Gunkel. Worshipful Brother Keith is going to help me keep time because this is a timed and formal debate. Each of these guys are allocated a certain number of minutes in which they make their arguments. As they are speaking, when they get to a point where they only have 1 minute left, they will see a yellow card held up. When that minute has expired and your time has run out, you will see a red card and you will hear a Verdun Bell, compliments of the Verdun Bell Company in Cincinnati. The question that we're going to be debating this evening, Worshipful Brother Keith, is on that piece of paper in front of you, I think. Would you be kind enough to read that?
The primary business of a Masonic Lodge is the exploration and study of the philosophy and symbols of Freemasonry, and not that of a public service club.
So that is the question that we'll be debating and exploring this evening. Our debate teams are Brother Darren Gulliffe on the affirmative team, Worshipful Brother John Sissel on the affirmative team. The negative team is Worshipful Brother Rich Hansen and Worshipful Brother Eddie Hazler. The affirmative team goes first. The first speaker is Brother Darren Gulliffe.
Well, thanks for having me here. I appreciate the William O. Ware Lodge of Research for this opportunity, and that it's an important one. And it gets to the core of who we are as an organization and what is it we're supposed to be doing as Freemasons. So the position that I'm going to take is that our ritual kind of tells us this. Our ritual is, in fact, incredibly clear as to what we are to do and how we are to act in order to claim the title of a Freemason. We will not repeat entirely, of course, all of our ritual, but we'll highlight a few portions with a focus on the entered apprentice degree that indicate the work in which we as Freemasons are to engage. So before our communications actually even begin, the Master in his opening charge, which we heard not too long ago, directs us to apply ourselves with zeal to the practice of the excellent principles inculcated by our order. Ever remembering that the great objects of our association are the restraint of improper desires and passions, the cultivation of active benevolence, and the promotion of correct knowledge in the duties we owe to God, our neighbor, our country, and ourselves. So to this end, we should thus act with poise, dignity, and as gentlemen, the labors to become better men. So the Master is very clear here in his assertion that the Lodge is about to engage in labor. We're going to be doing something here, and is very specific as to how we should conduct ourselves to further his directives. So getting on to the degree ritual. So as a mere candidate, upon entry to the Lodge for the very first time, we are told in no uncertain terms that we are about to participate in something very atypical. And the Worshipful Master, prays for us and implores the great architect of the universe to endue them, we as candidates, with the competency of thy divine wisdom, and that by the pure principles of our art, they may be better enabled to display the beauties of holiness to the honor of thy holy name. So the things to follow are nothing to be treated lightly, is the implication. Yet the design of the Masonic institution, the Master subsequently assures us, is to make its votaries wiser, better, and consequently happier. So the ritual of the degree proceeds in a manner in which we are all familiar and concludes with the Master distributing the working tools. And so this conferral unfolds, as we all know, with the phrase, "But we as free and accepted Masons are taught to make use of them for the more noble and glorious purposes of," in this case, an entered apprentice degree, first, managing our time with the 24-inch gauge, and then, with the aid of the common gavel, of divesting our hearts and consciences of all the vices and superfluities of life, thereby fitting our minds as living stones in that spiritual building, that house, not made of hands, eternal in the heavens. This more noble and glorious purpose is what we are tasked to do as Freemasons. Initiation, however, does not by itself make us a true Mason. but only lays the foundation. And it is incumbent upon each of us, through labor, to complete the work. And we should note that all three of the degrees conclude with this presentation of working tools. And we know those. First, these tools are going to be reflected internally in the inner apprentice degree, then externally with the fellowcraft degree, and then lastly, in the Master Mason degree, a more spiritual focus. So through this working these tools, what we will see is that we're going to be improving not only ourselves, but all mankind as well. And such work is not easy. But a properly functioning lodge provides a space, an incubator, if you will, of for a discussion into the philosophical underpinnings of the craft, so that we may be better prepared to conduct the work of Masons. And then at the close of each lodge meeting, which we'll hear in a little while, the master reminds us that the purpose of the lodge is to do just that, by declaring, let it not be supposed that you have labored here in vain and spent your strength for naught, for your work is with the Lord, and your recompense with God. So lastly, my brothers, I would like to share some words of a very eminent Freemason who quite plainly states, if Freemasonry is going to mean anything, if Freemasonry is going to mean anything to a man, and he to it, he must spend some time with it. And the lodge should be, and is always designed to be, the locus where we as brethren are to spend time with the craft. The lodge is where we share insights and make ourselves better so that we can make the world better.
Good evening, worship brothers all. It's an honor to be a small part of such a historic project as William O. Ware is undertaking here. One of the beginning things I would like to ask you is to not check your common sense at the door when you came through the altar there, or the threshold of that door. I myself and worship brother Rich can only speak from personal experiences from our environment and our surroundings. As Brother Darren mentioned in the entered apprentice degree and gives some great examples of that, I'd like to draw your attention to the fellowcraft degree, and the fact that in the fellowcraft degree we are taught that Freemasonry is truly a progressive science. The origin of Masonic charity was lectured to me in this very room by the late Right Worshipful past Grand Secretary of the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania, Tom Jackson. He explained that charity began in the great buildings of the cathedrals and the temples and the castles in Northern Europe, and when a man of a degree of masonry would fall from high elevations and would receive serious wounds, but they would tithe their salaries. They would put together a total amount of money and be able to give that for the charity of that brother. And I ask that we don't check our common sense at the door, and we realize that there will be no right or wrong to come from this, but yet light for all of Freemasonry, for all of us to take out of this room at the end of the evening. Thank you.
First, let me thank you for being invited to this prestigious event. I also want to thank you for your attention and your most valuable commodity, your time. Is the primary business of Masonic Lodge the exploration and study of philosophies and symbols? Or is it that of a public service club? That's a mighty, mighty big question. A very well-respected author once wrote, "No person in this room today, no master of a lodge, no grand master of a grand lodge, no person anywhere has the right to define Freemasonry. The reason for this is simple. Freemasonry defines itself. And that's exactly what I intend to show you with the remainder of my time. And for anybody that's wondering who that famous author may be, he is Mr. Dan Kimball. Brethren, any entity on this globe can have a mission statement, rules of order, members who write books and articles containing theories. But this all alludes to their brand. It's all it alludes to. It's our daily actions that define who we really are. So as everyone on this platform gives a feeble attempt at definition for the word primary, or what Webster's calls chief importance. We only have one thing to really look at, and that's Freemasonry's actions, not its words. In the United States, if I commit a crime and profess my innocence, that does not make me innocent. My actions are examined by a judge, a jury, and my peers. And a sentence is imposed on who I truly am and what I have truly done, not in the least of who I profess myself to be. Evidence rules reality, gentlemen. And I ask you this evening, as intelligent critical thinkers, to only consider the evidence of Freemasonry's actions, not the flowery words of our hopes and desires. Another Masonic author we may all be familiar with, Brother John Bizak, states in his paper, The Great Masonic Can Kicking, that Masonic historians will not be writing about the millions of men who were made members as something that made Masonry wildly successful. Rather, the narrative will be about how allowing millions to be made members, only to have the craft drift from the historical aim, purpose, and intent, eventually brought organized Masonry to a reckoning. Historical aim, purpose, and intent are not the same things, primary focus. What we are doing today in the present is the primary business. And any rational and intelligent person, such as yourself, will recognize this concept. Once again, our wonderful Dan Kimball wrote in another article. He likes to write some articles, Jim. Changing Demographics of Freemasonry. He says that in contemporary Freemasonry, including Kentucky Freemasonry, lodges have taken on the character of civic clubs, immersing themselves in countless community-oriented projects. He says we raise and we give away significant sums of money, frequently while our own infrastructure is in disrepair. We hold benefits and dinners for veterans, schools, and PTAs, and the list of our laudable efforts goes on and on without end. He even states, now to be clear, gentlemen, there is nothing inherently wrong with civic improvement projects. So, if demographics change, maybe the purpose of the business has to change as well. The Constitution of Freemasonry is no different than our great Constitution of the United States of America. It's a living, breathing document that changes by proposed legislation, amendments, and ratifications. It gives us guidelines to live by, not only as individual Masons, but as an organization. And the power of the local lodges and each individual member gets to determine who they become and what they teach. Now let's take a look real quick. We've got a minute left. Let's take a look at the actions of the majority of lodges within our own state. How many primary education lodges do we have? How many primary philosophical lodges do we have? How many lodges have you sat in the past 5 or 10 years that have taught in-depth symbolism? I bet we could count them on one hand and still have fingers left over. By a show of hands, how many have given away bicycles this year? Don't you be lying, gentlemen. How many donated to veterans? Anyone buy any charitable pins or ties to help the community organizations? Gentlemen, I once again implore you not to let yourself get confused by original intent and primary focus. They are not the same thing.
Thank you, Bishop Brother, for your insight. I want to be clear. Your position is that our time is our most valuable commodity. And today our primary business, not our brand, not our mission, not our statements, but our actions are defined by our intentions, and thereby the primary business of a lodge, thus equally designed. Is that a fair statement?
Fair state.
Also be clear that you've appealed to writings of eminent brothers in this room.
Correct.
Are you familiar with the definition of straw man argument or the appeal to authority?
Highly possible.
If you brothers aren't aware, the straw man argument is the obfuscation that he's just endeavored to lead you down. So let me answer with this. Any public service organization not founded on key principles and high ideals becomes unmoored, as you defined the history of Freemasonry in Kentucky, subject to popular opinions, trends, and even the caprice and prejudice of its members. The proper focus is actually on the timeless elements of our core beliefs, our landmarks, and foundational principles. Those define us, invariably avoiding us being led from the wrong direction, regardless of any perceived urgency of the moment. So your argument is that our behaviors, which have been handed down to us for 1,000 years, is what defines the primary focus of the lodge. But you base that on the experiences of men who have not sat in the lodge for, with the exception of most worship past Grand Master, more than 30 years in the most part. So I would argue that your conclusions are founded in the wrong experience. And as a result, you are obligated to engage the common sense that your partner asked us not to check at the door, and recognize that if this is the primary business of Masonry, are we successful?
It's a question. I think we can see by the numbers that we deal with today.
That we are not successful. That'll be all. My brothers, determining the primary business of any organization is best achieved by answering what the purpose of that organization is. That can be achieved by looking at the historic documents of its establishment and a review of its foundational documents and core principles. In the case of organized Freemasonry, the generally accepted history states that organized Freemasonry was established at the Goose and Gridiron Tavern on the Feast of St. John in 1717, where Anthony Sayer was elected the first Grand Master, and goes on to state that the purpose of this gathering was to revive the annual feast and quarterly communications, which is the first clue to the original purpose of Freemasonry, and by extension, each Masonic Lodge. Next, a review of the early written history provides us some additional clues as to the intent of those in attendance that day. No meetings were kept at that event, and we have to acknowledge that history was recorded and subject to potentially faulty memories. It's necessary to clearly point out as well that the history recorded that day is first published by Dr. James Anderson in his second iteration of the Book of Constitutions, published in 1738. While some would argue that makes the history unreliable, they choose to ignore the fact that Anderson worked on behalf of the Grand Lodge, and that both the 1723 and 38 versions of the Constitutions were vetted by a committee of that Grand Lodge before it went to print. And although writing 20 years after the events, there would still have been brethren around who were involved in those early days, including, most notably, Dr. John T. disagreeable, who was Grand Master in 1719 and Deputy Grand Master in 1722, 23, and 25, and likely would have been very quick to point out any errors of fact in Dr. Anderson's comments on the founding events. Nothing in either the 23 or 38 versions of the Constitutions indicates anything related to public service being the chief focus of the fraternity. However, Anderson detailed the charges and regulations which are based on the Enlightenment principles that the Grand Lodge was seeking to advance. Freemasons the world over are accustomed to hearing a portion of those texts during the annual installation ceremony, where the Master-elect responds to a series of questions and agrees to uphold those ancient charges and regulations. And included in those are items pertaining to the management of the craft that honors the long-standing practice of using operative Masonic tools allegorically, as well as a charge pertaining to acceptable behavior, detailing etiquette, personal conduct, civility, and morality. This, then, is our second significant piece of evidence in support of our argument. The Enlightenment principles that were central to the endeavors of the early Grand Lodge now require some examination. The Enlightenment, of course, refers to that broad terms of philosophy that emerged in Northern Europe in the late 17th and early 18th century. Its defining characteristics include a belief in reason, personal liberty, and the search for knowledge through scientific method and rational observation. Among the values of the Enlightenment are religious toleration, constitutional government, civic responsibility, meritocracy, and the promotion of societal and personal advantages that flow from courtesy, charity, education, and self-improvement. Freemasons recognize these concepts from every part of the ritual, but will notably recognize them from the fellowcraft lecture focusing on the 7 liberal arts and sciences, where they are encouraged to make a lifelong study of each discipline. Masonic values are frequently summarized as 3 great principles of brotherly love, relief, and truth. In this context, brotherly love can be considered a shorthand expression for the promotion and practice of consideration of others, that is, for mankind or humanity. Relief is the promotion and practice of benevolence and charity, not simply relieving poverty, but also distress and suffering more generally. Truth refers to education and improving one's understanding of both the world and oneself, whereby Freemasons are encouraged to focus on the advantages of education, by which means alone we are rendered fit members of regularly organized society. To argue that any of this indicates that the chief purpose of a Masonic Lodge is that of a public service club is a hasty generalization that relies on an incomplete understanding of those terms, brotherly love and relief, and wholly ignores the definitions of each of these tenets. While history prior to 1717 is even hazier, there's clear evidence of Freemasonry, including records from Scotland, that also informs us on this matter. In Edinburgh, Mary's Chapel Lodge number 1 was over 100 years old already by 1717, and their records include references to William Shaw, who was appointed the Master of Works by King James VII at the end of the 16th century, and who Scottish Freemasons referred to as the father of modern Freemasonry. The rules that Shaw instituted establish the Mason's word as law and codifies the art of memory, or the memory palace, which is a mnemonic device utilized by ancient Greeks and Romans skilled in the art of rhetoric to retain vast amounts of information and to present the information in a structured flow. Clearly, Shaw had institutionalized education as a core Mason principle. Finally, in 1641, Sir Robert Murray was initiated by St. Mary's Chapel Lodge. This initiate is significant as he's often referred to as the first speculative Freemason initiated on any English soil. It's challenging to prove that claim entirely, but we acknowledge that he was at various times a general, a Lord Justice Clerk, Lord of Sessions at Edinburgh, and most importantly, and relevant to this discussion, he's best known as a founder of the Royal Society of London for the Improvement of Knowledge, simply known today as the Royal Society, whose stated purpose is to bring different types of men together in the study of science. The persistent facts of history, not the fairy tales that fill both the internet and the minds of the uninformed or undereducated, all clearly point to the simple conclusion that Freemasonry was founded with the intent of improving oneself through the exploration and study of the philosophy and symbols of Freemasonry. Any good deeds in the community, charity, or any other outward expressions of public service are the result of that improvement of the man, not the purpose of this organization.
Thank you, Brother Sisson, for that wonderful history lesson from all the old dusty books that nobody reads. I believe Albert Mackey wrote an article on reading Masons and Masons who do not read, and I think it would probably pay you a good effort to go ahead and read that so he can scathe you as well as he has the rest of us. So I got a question. How, since you gave us a really nice history lesson, how does that help us today? And do you feel that our actions mirror as a fraternity as a whole, not just Lexington 1 and William Ware? Do you feel that the actions of all those history lessons mirror what we are involved in today?
Let's take that in 2 parts. Your first question is, how does that inform us today? And the answer is, if you don't know where you came from, you don't know where you're going. And unfortunately, we have, for 150 years, been slowly drifting from the path. The core of both of the authors that you spoke of earlier, their message is that Freemasonry generally has become adrift. Now, why did we become adrift? Some of it would be because we've overexpanded too fast. Some of it is because we failed early in the education in the United States. The United States is the only place in Freemasonry where a man can go from root to fruit in 24 hours, 90 days. You know, if you talk to my mutual brethren here who were initiated, passed, and raised in Cuba, they're going to tell you it takes a whole lot longer to get through. And as such, they're going to have experienced Freemasonry in a truer form than what we see in the United States. So how does that inform us? It answers the question, where did we come from? And why are we not successful? We've not been successful in membership for 65 years. Why have we not been successful? Because we offer nothing of value to attract a man. Why do we not offer nothing of value? Because if we're interested in going out and participating in charity, we can go do a Habitat for Humanity drill. We can go, thank you very much, We can proceed with work with United Way. We can proceed with work at various countless numbers of charitable activities. And all the money that we raise, we don't raise that. Shrine raises that. Your second question, I've lost because I got off on topic.
Oh, no worries. I think your time is pretty much close up. But I would say the original intent does not mirror the primary focus of today. Love the original intent, though. Great lesson.
Brothers, as I mentioned earlier, I had the pleasure of standing in this room and listening to the late Worshipful Tom Jackson give several presentations over the years. One of his articles that I stumbled onto that kind of related to this almost agrees with both sides and tries to find some common ground in the middle was an article he presented in 2004 to the Bloom Friar lecture. It was titled "A Charity as Our Core of the Craft." He details his travels around the globe. I believe he was honorary Grand Master in about 17 countries before he passed away. He says, and I quote, "I found in Europe, for example, that Freemasonry had retained much more of a philosophical quality that characterized it in the early life. This is not too difficult to understand, since its origin was in Europe, and there was greater degree of stability existing due to the age of the countries, and therefore lesser stimulus to diverge. Hence, European history displays a more philosophical form of Freemasonry than is found in the rest of the world." He goes on to say, and I quote, "In contrast to the philosophical style in Central America and South America, have a form of Freemasonry more driven by sociological demands of its environment. It retains the basic tenets of Freemasonry, while the operational practices tend to take on more of an idealistic, progressive approach in establishing the goals of the craft to meet the needs of society to which it exists. Its idealism causes it to seek more lofty goals than is generally found elsewhere in the Masonic world. Hence, we find more sociological form of Freemasonry. While in Mexico mirrors much of the sociological style, it does not seem to fit comfortably into. Freemasonry there has a tendency to become more involved with the political factions of the country, and therefore is more political in style." He follows up with addressing North America, and I quote, "In North America we have lost much of the philosophical qualities by which the craft is known, probably due to an acquainted clemency in recent years. Perhaps this complacency is a result of the absence of the same social needs as those countries to our south. What we have evolved into, however, is an organization that places much emphasis and effort on raising money and funding charities." He closes by saying, "We as North American crafts seem to have developed a driving need to raise money for charity, and as a result, I find myself out of step with much of North American leadership in this regard. I believe both of our brothers have identified those things. But what I mentioned earlier when I opened my comments was myself and Worship Brother Rich can only speak to the environment in which we live in. The environment in which we live in that allows men to come to the door is not the same environment that we see all over the place. Freemasonry can exist in different locations with different reasons. The same core principles there, but maybe not the same attractive look from the outside world. For example, men that come, what we have to deal with at Eastern Kentucky, where I'm from, is staggering numbers of the problems of the core of pool that we would pull membership from. The age group of 35 to 45-year-olds has the highest number of drug overdose deaths between 2023 at 571 deaths. The fentanyl factor in Eastern Kentucky among 18 to 45-year-olds. Fatal overdose is now the #1 cause of death in Eastern Kentucky. Eastern Kentucky, the methamphetamine was found in 1,095 drug overdose deaths. This represents 55.2 of the total drug overdose deaths the year, that decrease of 6.2 from the 1,168 drug overdose deaths, methamphetamine, in 2022. A major shift in Eastern Kentucky. Oxycodone was found in 154 drug overdose deaths. This represents a decrease of 7.2 from the 166 drug overdose deaths involving oxycodone in 2022. If you add depopulation in an area to that, then you have to ask, how bad is Freemasonry appearing of being a social club that helps its community? How bad is that? During the same period, 5 eastern Kentucky counties that make up the Big Sandy Area Development District area, Floyd, Johnson, Martin, and Magoffin, has lost nearly 13,900 people. That's 9% of the population in 2 years. So I have to ask of you, how big of a problem is the definition of the social club, or being appeared as a social club that helps their local community? I humbly have to ask you that, because I believe that organizations such as Rotary, Kiwanis, Rotary being known as an organization that destroyed polio, is now organizations that are thriving, that are helping these people live, whether it be Rotary, Kiwanis, Lions Club, whatever is in your community. Why not use those organizations that clearly are selfless to come to our door and fill up our lodges and use them as a vetting organization, as so many other organizations has used Masonry for many, many years? Thank you for your time.
Brother Eddie, that was a fantastic talk. I appreciate that. The issues in your part of the state are troubling. But, now, I thought about this the other day when I was kind of stuck in traffic. And so would you agree with me that the School of Accountancy at the College of Business Administration, the primary purpose of that school is to educate young people, to provide them skills to be informed on generally accepted accounting principles where they can provide tax services to people when they graduate.
Absolutely.
That, of course, seems to be their primary goal. Yet they don't offer tax services themselves. That's not the purpose of the School of Accounting, is it?
Not by definition.
No. Yeah, so I think that's the distinction here that I think we need to make, is that Freemasonry, while these things are problematic in our societies that we're concerned about, and things that we as individuals, of course, as Masons, want to try to address, and we'll volunteer ourselves for that. And because that's what Freemasonry is, it makes men who care about other people. But it's not the function of the lodge to do that. The function of the lodge is to teach men Masonry so that they behave as Masons outside the lodge. Would you agree with that?
I believe that was the initial principle.
Well, that's all the questions I have. So our labor involves something greater than just ourselves, my brothers. And such work is not easy. You know, Brother John and I have demonstrated that our ritual and history suggests that this to be an incontrovertible fact. You know, I think any other assertion is a bit of a distraction from the true purpose of Freemasonry. The mission of a Freemason's lodge is certainly not in the purview of a mere service club. You know, our good friends, as Eddie noted, Rotary, the Elks, the Odd Fellows, I left out Kiwanis Club, sorry for those guys, but other service clubs out there should be commended for the efforts they do in their communities. But they are simply treating a symptom of society's ills and not endeavoring to remedy them as we as Freemasons are tasked to do. That's the key difference here in my mind. So simply put, I believe that society would be better off with more thoughtful Freemasons, and we should do everything that we can to promote that and advance a civil society. You know, when we say things like Freemasonry is a system of morality veiled in allegory and illustrated by symbols, well, we mean something by that, right? You know, if our ritual work and symbolism have no implications beyond their face value, and if we don't understand what those implications are, then we're no better than just a stage crew acting out and pretending to be something we really aren't, and hiding behind a sense of secrecy maybe and a historic tradition. So a lodge, therefore, should assume as its primary task an agenda that fosters the creation of more true Freemasons. You know, what I mean by that is that a lodge should be dedicated to making men who have a sense of purpose in their labor. They understand how to do that, and more simply than members on a roster. So in order to accomplish this goal, the lodge must explore the philosophical underpinnings and symbols of Freemasonry so that its members can behave as Freemasons while laboring outside the lodge room.
Brethren, in the words of our past Grand Master, Ernest Jackson, I'm going to bore you with some Masonic education real quick. In an article titled Philanthropy, History, and Freemasons, it states that in the early 1700s, the European Enlightenment was making its way across the Atlantic Ocean. It was coming to the American colonies. Much like the Enlightenment ideas of Europe, Enlightenment thinkers emphasized the logical views of the world while underestimating and disregarding the role of religion. This caused a religious divide among the 13 colonies of most of the New England was affiliated with congregational churches. There were Anglicans, Baptists, Presbyterians, and Quakers. The Great Awakening came to reinstate religion back into the public life. And it emphasizes that all people are born sinners, even you too. And that the salvation and forgiveness should be sought from God. It also emphasized that religion should not be a formal or institutionalized, but rather personal or causal. A key feature of this era is that charity, as well as philanthropy, become more individualistic actions. One of the lasting impacts of the Great Awakening is an emphasis on unmeditated charity that should be handled by individuals and not churches. Instead of churches taking care of charity, now individuals are in full control of that. And it is not only the rich or the clergy who can give, but almost everyone is able to. George Whitefield, a famous preacher of this movement, who was also a Freemason, was preaching in many states in the U.S. He called on people to take care of each other, and he collected donations in each preach to use for good causes. Such donations were used to relieve victims of disaster, orphanages, release debtors from prison, and fund educational institutions such as Harvard and Dartmouth. The Anglican movement was soon to follow. It was honored with what was called the St. John's Day sermons that date back to the medieval heritage of divine worship. It is written in these times that Freemasons who were heavily involved in philanthropic activities selected a popular preacher on that day and supported the event by ensuring large attendance among its members. This often resulted in large donations for the poor, the needy, the sick. George Whitefield was well-known. He was a well-known evangelist, as I briefly talked about earlier. He preached the first American Masonic charity sermon, June 24th, 1738. He preached to raise funds, the importance of charity, and the need for virtuous behavior and solidarity among humans. According to these preachers, the purpose of society is to encourage innate love among humans, being and caring for each other, transcending divisions and differences, uniting in brotherhood. Freemasons introduced themselves as cultivated elite, coming together for the common good of humanity. Through the fraternity's charity, though the fraternity's charity was intended for group members in the time of community in distress and crisis, Masons soon extended the financial aid to those who needed it most in their communities, which to me, brethren, is the core definition of the primary business. Remember, once again, the original intent is not the primary focus today. What we do today is what we are today.
My original intent was to be Michael Jordan. I had to really look in the mirror, and my primary focus was to be realistic. You're not.
Brothers, the opposition this evening would have you conclude that the primary business of the Masonic Lodge is not the exploration and study of philosophy and symbols of Freemasonry, but that it's instead intended to some variation of public service club. We live in an age where access to information is ubiquitous, and yet knowledge seems elusive. We can connect to each other at any time we please, yet we are suffering from an epidemic of isolation and loneliness. Thus, we live in a time that has largely forgotten the lessons of our history and our ritual, and that has traded this superiority for just enough, and where excellence is functionally obsolete. Freemasonry is about excellence, education, and connection. They would have you conclude that our current activities define us and our intentions. Our actions are leading to the failure of Masonry, however. So says the last 65 years. Freemasonry defines itself. So did the Oddfellows. If you don't know about those guys, that's because they don't hardly exist anymore. They would have you conclude that environmental conditions are the reason that the public service is our primary purpose today. But I would argue that education is again the clearest path out of poverty. They would have you conclude that we've evolved from the foundational principles of the Enlightenment. Yet, I would argue that the conditions that led to the Enlightenment seem to be back in play today. We need to return to reason and scientific methods as they are under attack now more than ever. We need to once again fight for acceptance of universal humanity, tolerance, and freedom to think, pray, and believe, as these all seem also to be at risk. Finally, they would have you conclude that the Great Awakening was in fact a pivot from the intentional purpose of Masonry, and instead, we are now a charity organization, yet the first major charitable endeavor was here in Kentucky after the Civil War, nearly 100 years after the Great Awakening. One would have you believe that charity is the principal aim of Freemasonry just by misquoting 1 Corinthians that says, "And now abideth faith, hope, and charity. These three, but the greatest of these is charity." But in this case, my brothers, charity is derived from the Greek word agape, which is often most frequently used to describe God's love for us. And thus we are taught as a true Mason that we will have a love for our fellow human being akin to that of the great architect. All of these arguments distort the actual intent of Freemasonry. Unfortunately for them, the Masonic symbolism of the beehive does not simply indicate droning about in a meaningless activity associated with fundraisers, car shows, fish fries, or golf scrambles. No, that emblem is a call to industriousness, to labor and to cooperation, where we should endeavor to add to the common stock of knowledge, and cautions us against intellectual laziness. To argue that our purpose is anything other than that is to seek to improve ourselves by learning, by study and exploration, by associating ourselves with other men of character who also seek to do these things, is to have completely missed the important principles of this organization. One of the results of being a better man and an industrious part of a rational society is that you endeavor to improve the circumstances of those around you. I grant you. But that is only one of the results, not all of them. Thus, the goal of Freemasonry is not just to be some charitable public service club. Charity is not the goal. Charity is an outcome. It is an outcome of self-improvement, the association with other like-minded men, and the study and explorations of the symbols and philosophy of our order.
My brothers, I have to agree with Brother John on a couple of things he said there, wholeheartedly. But I would like to add an addendum to that. Myself and Brother Rich, given this topic and the viewpoint from which we had to present it, we don't conclude that practice of Freemasonry as a social club is what our main goal should be. But we believe it is a factor of what it is now. It's not what we become on our doing. No one in this room led Freemasonry to what it is now from its intent. The definition I looked up, and me and Brother Rich, Worst Brother Rich, spoke on the way down here, was just exactly what is a service club. And the definition from Britannica was business and professional men that promotes fellowship among its members and is devoted to the principle of volunteer community service. The idea of the service club originated in the United States, as our brothers have alluded to, from Freemasonry in Europe. And it has its greatest popularity here. Although service clubs now exist in many other countries, they are often linked in international associations. All service clubs have high principle mottos and creeds, such as Rotary International that we spoke of, whose creed is service above self. About half of these clubs are semi-rural communities, in which both of us came from, which I mentioned we would only speak from the environment in which we were raised in. They have memberships of less than 50, just as our Masonic Lodges do. Most hold luncheons or dinner meetings every week, hence the fish fry Brother John mentioned. The idea of creating a civilian service club originated in 1905 with Paul Harris, a young attorney in Chicago. His plan of organization envisioned all essential features of the present-day service club that included the classification principle that restricts memberships in a given club to a quota from each business or profession. Gentlemen, I've been a detective for 22 years, and I've seen some of the worst possible things that you can see in humanity. And again, I will only speak from the environment in which I was raised in, where I exist now. The bicycle program that to us means so trivial, and we know it's trivial. We know it's not educating a man within a lodge, has its purposes. It has its purposes, whether it's a young man sitting in a room or a young male teacher who says, what is Masonry? How can I be a part of that to help our community? Do I believe that we should be driven as a service club solely and not the teachings and the tenets of Freemasonry? Absolutely not. We're shortchanging the multiple factors that make us Masons. But I ask you, please, with your heartfelt thoughts and mind, consider this is where we're at now. So how can we make it better? And I think the way to make it better is to blend the two and become the best that we can possibly be. Thank you for your attention this evening.
If you appreciate the preparation that these men engaged in for this evening, would you please recognize them